So imagine naming your channel Redacted and then in effect getting rejected by YouTube. Well, that is the channel that I'm going to review today, a video from that channel. They got suspended by YouTube for 2 weeks. They posted on their own social media that it was because of hate speech violation and other violations that they had on YouTube. And I have to say that this particular channel and its coverage of Russia's war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's actually day 86 of the invasion when I'm filming this, for reference about information I had to hand when I started shooting. And many viewers, especially my live streams, asked me to react to Redacted and their coverage of the war in Ukraine. I have to say, it is some of the most face-palming type of content that I've seen so far in all the videos that I've had to sit through since the war started. So let's get into review video and check out Redacted that got redacted. Поехали!
SAR Experience.
So as you can see, I'm in the beautiful green Emerald Isle of Ireland still, where I've relocated to in part since Russia's invasion of Ukraine when I had to leave. And so who are these people redacted? They are a couple, Clayton and Natalie Morris, and they are former mainstream media. I'm just reading what's on the channel information here on YouTube, and which they write themselves. And Clayton Morris is a former Fox News anchor. And let me see what their kind of slogan is. They say Redacted is an independent platform unencumbered by external factors or restrictive policies on which Clayton and Natalie Morris bring you quality information, balanced reporting, constructive debate, and thoughtful narratives. So there are 4 things that they claim that their channel is about. Let's see as we go into this video that in fact got suspended from YouTube. They were redacted, the Redacted channel, and it was, when I click on the link on YouTube, which obviously doesn't show me the video anymore, it said it was blocked for hate speech. So very particular. So you can also be a judge as I show you clips on this, whether this is hate speech or not.
Well, the Western media story about Eastern Ukraine is starting to collapse as journalists begin to uncover the truth there. The mass graves story in Mariupol is fake. The story at the maternity ward has new facts that show it was staged. The story about the theater being attacked also falling apart thanks to some amazing boots on the ground journalism.
So there are 3 big claims starting off the video, that basically 3 examples of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. He's saying they're all fake, they're not true at all. Let's see as we go along.
I want to show you some new video that you will not see on your billionaire-funded local news stations or anywhere else. This is newly released video of women and families waving and blessing as soldiers drive by. Now, these are Russian soldiers, okay, as they liberate towns in eastern Ukraine.
All right, so the first thing there he starts off the video with is he shows a clip that I've already seen on pro-Russian social media, which is Russian armor driving through what is supposed to be allegedly parts of eastern Ukraine. They've newly occupied, they're not liberating it, but anyways, that's, you know, if you use the word liberated, it means you're in favor of this. If you use the word occupied, then probably you're against it. So you can say I'm against the Russian invasion. What can we say about this Clayton Morris? It appears already that he's in favor of it because he's claiming it's liberated. And it purports to show locals cheering on, greeting basically the Russian troops.
CNN and MSNBC wish this video were fake. It's not, but they won't show it to you.
So he's trying to set the stage as if there's a big conspiracy that, oh, they're not showing you this. Well, first of all, it's for pro-Russian social media, the invading army. So whether they decide to show it or not, yeah, why show this in the first place? It's a bit like showing Nazi footage of cheering Poles. There were probably some ethnic Germans who cheered on the Nazi forces into Poland in 1939. I'm not too sure there was anyone cheering on the Soviet forces when they invaded from the other side. But yeah, that's obviously war propaganda, whether they decide to show it or not. Yeah, that's kind of an editorial call.
How many people watching right now have seen this video on your local news stations or on CNN or MSNBC or Fox or anywhere else?
So that's important because he's setting the stage as if there's kind of a big conspiracy. And what I've noticed in this war, a lot of the audience, I think, the YouTube channels or the social media influencers who are supporting Russia is they're trying to go off after, and I mean in English of course, they're trying to go after kind of the Alex Jones audience, because Alex Jones isn't on any of these social media platforms anymore, so everything's a big conspiracy, and you know, he was entertaining and kind of almost like satire. I don't really think anyone should have been taking him too seriously for 95% of the stuff he was saying. There is a certain audience that really wants to believe these. He's starting to get excited by it, right? This kind of like, ooh, the mainstream media is hiding this from you. I mean, if you just subscribe to pro-Russian social media on your phone, you can watch this all day if you want to, believe me.
These are women, families waving and blessing. Look at this. Russian soldiers as they move into different towns in eastern Ukraine to liberate these areas. Now, we're going to get into the details of this.
Well, I see about, was it half a dozen women and one man. And this is all of eastern Ukraine. This is, yeah, let's just assume this is not staged for a minute, right? Just for the cameras, so Russia can claim that at least some people were supporting them. There's about 6 or 7 people there. And how many people lived in eastern Ukraine? How many millions in the areas that they invaded? I don't know exactly. I don't have the figure in front of me, but it's going to be, let's see, in Kharkiv, there's 1.5 million people in the city. Let's see, with Mariupol, 500,000 people. And never mind the parts, obviously, in the north with Kiev and all that kind of stuff. There's a few million people there, and they have 7. 6 women, 1 man, and he's calling that families. Yeah, that's quite loose language in terms of describing the scene.
Because it's complicated and it's nuanced, but I wanted you to see it. Now, why would these people be waving and blessing these Russian soldiers as they come into their towns?
He's got a grandma.
There's a story here. There's a big story.
It's a massive story, though.
And it's been covered up and hidden from you. It's a story that all of these people know very well, but you don't because your Western media has kept it from you.
All right, so there's a big plot, you know, in the Western media. That's what he's trying to trap into for his audience straight away. That people are hiding this from you. There are 8 people amongst millions of Ukrainians who support Russia's invasion. Perhaps, if it's not staged. Yeah, and there are, of course, some people in eastern Ukraine who do support the invasion. Just like there were some people in Poland, a very small minority, who supported the Nazi invasion in 1939. And there's a reason why I'm going to mention Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union's joint invasion of Poland in 1939, because I think it's a very comparable event to what we have today. No 2 wars are 100% comparable, but I think there's a lot of overlap between them. So anyways, let's skip ahead.
So now that certain areas have been liberated of Nazis.
So there he claims that certain areas have been liberated of Nazis. So who is he talking about exactly? Because in the villages he just showed, well, there's just a few civilians left and there are Russian troops driving through them. So we're not sure what he's doing.
The Russian army has been setting up humanitarian centers.
Oh, aren't they great humanitarians? Like, if you watch a Nazi propaganda film about the invasion of Poland, they will show you, what, local people cheering on the German forces. They come in offering them tea, and then the Germans been very benign. I mean, we know, obviously, looking back that, well, it was an evil genocidal regime, Nazi Germany, and well, also Soviet Union under Stalin, also genocidal regime. So we don't take that seriously when we just think it, well, yeah, it's just a propaganda film. So interesting, the analogies here.
Ava Bartlett, she is Canadian. She's a journalist who's covered Syria. She's in eastern Ukraine covering the removal of the Azov Nazi battalion. But before the humanitarian aid arrived, as a bloody war in this region. So to listen to the Russian government mission was a denazification of Ukraine.
So there he brings up a Western journalist, and in this video he's going to react to basically a series of Westerners who are supporting Russia with their coverage in the war. He doesn't mention that this Ava Bartlett actually works for RT, which is Russia Today. It's state media of Russia. Again, would you trust a journalist from the West who was working for Nazi Germany's news service in 1939 when they invaded Poland? I think you probably wouldn't trust them. I think that they're very credible, but Clayton Morris, no problem in trusting them. And he doesn't even mention it. By the way, he's already hiding that from his audience, Mr. Conspiracy Theorist that he is.
Yes, in several parts of the areas that were controlled by the Ukrainian Nazi battalions, the Russian army is now distributing humanitarian assistance. This particular town was hit by these battalions and destroyed a factory, destroyed school, and there is a severe crisis.
All right, so then we flash to, this guy's name is Alejandro Kirk. It's actually not the Canadian journalist who's actually speaking. But anyways, so he is also part of this Western coverage, we'll call him. I'm not sure, I think he's from Chile originally, we'll just call him
Western.
since he's from the Western Hemisphere. And what I noticed, because I went and looked at his Twitter feed, is actually that he is definitely a left-wing socialist, a Marxist. And you might be thinking, well, why would a Marxist be supported? If he is a Marxist, we'll say socialist. Anyways, he's on the left wing. Why would someone from the left, it seems more towards the radical left, be supporting Russia or be covering the war from Russia's point of view? Because he's there in occupied Donbass doing this reportage, when Russia's obviously not communist, right? It's obviously not left-wing. It is a revanchist autocracy. We can have a big intellectual debate. Maybe I'll do another video about it. I already did one where I talked about denazification in Russia and Ukraine. I'll link it up above and down below. You know, we can have this intellectual conversation whether technically Russia is a fascist state or something else that's authoritarian and imperialistic, but it definitely ain't one thing, and that it definitely ain't a Marxist state. But what is very interesting is watching his coverage a bit myself, is that because these so-called republics, Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republics, the Russians now decided to recognize, they are set up a little bit along Marxist lines, which is probably why there's a certain amount of sympathy from these left-wing figures for this kind of regime. Yeah, it's basically an economic black hole that's been subsidized by Russia since 2014, which makes sense. It possibly is in some way Marxist run. And he refers to that a good bit in his coverage, how everything is organized along those lines. And moreover, what I see with a lot of the left-wing media, especially Marxist media, will take George Galloway, who's the leader of the British Workers' Party, as they are cheering on the Russians in their imperial invasion of Ukraine. And it is an imperial invasion. Go back to Vladimir Putin's speech 2 days before the war. He started off his speech with, Ukraine is not allowed to leave Russia's sphere of influence, and its borders are legitimate. That is just classic imperialism down through the ages. That's what always happened. Your country does not have a right to be independent of what we want, and your borders are illegitimate, so we're going to invade and change them, right? That's pretty classic imperialism. So why are they cheering on this imperialism when they always have this refrain about being against imperialism? It's because they see America and NATO as an even bigger imperialist than Russia. And there is no mention of the fact that, Russia has invaded, they are responsible. It is their behavior, their decision that has caused all this destruction in Donbass, right? All these buildings destroyed. It's because they decided to invade. All those dead people, all the people that they're now giving out with crocodile tears, oh, here's some humanitarian aid. It's Russia that's responsible, but you see how they report as if the Nazis were here. Again, this kind of conspiratorial, almost like sensationalist, fiction novel. So anyways, let's go on.
I have a guest. She's an American-Canadian journalist living in Russia.
Living in Russia.
Eva Bartlett.
So he's working for a channel called Telesur. I guess it's Latin American channel. Again, no mention of the fact that she's actually working for Russian state TV, i.e. Russian propaganda.
What's the humanitarian situation in the newly liberated areas of the Donbass?
So again, they call them newly liberated. You mean newly occupied is what most objective people would call them. And that includes everywhere in Ukraine that's been attacked and bombed, and obviously invading Russian forces have been there.
Well, I think as people will see behind us, people are lining up for the supplies, which are actually quite sufficient, it seems.
So these are what we call classic useful idiots. So useful idiot is a term that was coined, I think, by the Soviets, where basically they had these naive Westerners who would come to the Soviet Union and basically report everything is great here. They'd probably be shown some Potemkin village, like some place that's not very representative of the Soviet Union, and then they would go on to basically deny the horrors that, say, Stalin was inflicting on his own population in the Western media. They would go back and report, there would be a journalist who would say, no, this is all Western propaganda, Western imperialist propaganda, that the Soviets are starving the Ukrainians, with the Holodomor, for example, which was a man-made famine orchestrated by Stalin that killed millions and millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s in particular. So this is very similar. So let's go ahead. They do the typical useful idiot stuff where they're reporting basically Russian talking points, propaganda. This is actually why they are allowed to report in Russian occupied territory. If they were to go there and be there every day and give an objective reporting of the situation. They were not allowed to be there. It's part of the job. You can't be there. Like maybe they let you in once, maybe, because I've seen some Western journalists go into Mariupol, for example, and they seem to have the freedom to report, but they went once. They're not there every day with permanent access. And obviously she works for the propaganda channel of the Russian government in English. Clearly, yeah, she is not an objective reporter in the conflict for that reason. So anyways, let's skip ahead past this to Redacted's reaction.
So to listen to Russian government missions, when they said at the outset, why were they going into Ukraine? Why was Russia going into Ukraine? Why did Putin say this? Why did their foreign office say this? Why did their Ministry of Defense say this? All of it, every member of the Russian, the Russian Federation said this was the denazification of Ukraine. Well, the Western media laughed at that. Like, there's no Nazis there, even though we've covered them for years and now we're hiding it.
So here the implication is he basically repeats just standard Russian propaganda during this war. There's several key points that Russia keeps repeating. One is denazification. They built up this myth through the propaganda that Ukraine is just run by Nazis, right? In the beginning they seem directed actually at the president of Ukraine and the people around him, basically for an excuse of what we would call decapitation of leadership. Basically they were going to either kill, presumably capture, imprison, or force President Zelensky of Ukraine to flee the country, or he would just decide to leave, and then they can install a puppet government. And part of that was that they're basically Nazis. Then also you have the Azov Battalion. As I said, they're these guys that were set up originally as a battalion that did have leaders who have neo-Nazi views. It's since been integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces, and it's now called the Azov Regiment, and it basically operates as kind of like a special forces, a very highly motivated battalion nowadays, or regiment, not battalion, regiment of the Ukrainian armed forces. And in fact, with all this propaganda, watching what happened, for example, in Azovstal, in Mariupol, I have yet to see any evidence of the soldiers who were there from the Azov Regiment themselves being, the leadership, neo-Nazis. Now, I'm sure there's probably some guys there that are far right. It's an elite battalion in the army. It's probably going to be the same in the Russian army. They have the Wagner group, this kind of murky group of mercenaries who are also set up by a guy with neo-Nazi views, by the way. And I wouldn't extract out that and say, Russia is run by the Nazis, right? That's just fucking crazy to start claiming to extract that out, right? But that's basically what the Russian propaganda says. And yeah, it's then extrapolated and it has, from what I can see, there's a lot of evidence anyways from the testimonies of Russian prisoners of war that they got there believing that people who wouldn't cooperate with them were also pro-Nazi, that were part of the Nazis. So this is a big problem, because once you start to call people Nazis, then do you really see them as normal human beings? Do you think killing a Nazi would be justified? Well, you probably think it's more justified than killing a normal soldier. And I think that's the big, big danger with all of this propaganda. And also the civilians who, unlike what he tried to show at the beginning with the 8 or 9 people they're greeting the Russians, well, that's pretty small number of people compared to the general population. What happens to the rest of the people who are not out there waving? Are they all Nazis now, or Nazi sympathizers? And you can see how this becomes very dangerous when you have an occupying army that also believes this kind of rhetoric, or has been pumped up by this rhetoric, that they start to see everybody in this kind of way who doesn't greet them with bread and salt, as the Ukrainians traditionally greet people, but they're not doing it so much there. Anyways, let's go on.
Let's look more deeply now at the Battle of Mariupol. Listen to the people of Mariupol describe who did this to their city and who kept them hidden in basements. Listen.
So basically then he goes into taking the reports by these useful idiot reporters. So basically he goes on and he takes their clips, which basically deny any war crimes from the Russian government, in fact. And what they do is when they're reporting, they basically let a representative or an official from the Russian government speak and basically say, deny everything. And they think, oh, that's fine, that's my reporting. But you're just basically a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda. Or they go around and they interview civilians, and we'll just assume that there are not plants there, that is not organized. I mean, that's always possible. We can't really verify that. But in general, what kind of people do you think in Mariupol are going to be willing to speak to pro-Russian TV or Russian TV? Presumably, they're also flanked most of the time by Russian soldiers. But it's not people who are going to willingly voice a pro-Ukrainian position now, is it? And it would be the same if Ukraine seizes a town and there are pro-Russian people there or sympathizers. They're probably not going to go out in front of the Ukrainian soldiers and start giving a pro-Russian narrative, are they? Because number one, they might be scared of getting shot, imprisoned, because they would be seen as collaborators, and that would be the same in this case. Or they're just traumatized, and probably then you have a bias in terms of the number of the people who would have been more likely to stay on average, would have been the people who were maybe more sympathetic to Russia invading. Now, I'm not saying everybody who stayed was in that case. A lot of people just got trapped, but definitely I've seen a lot of other footage where the people who stayed behind in general didn't seem to be as against Russia as, say, the people who left, because they were like, damn, we need to get out of here before the Russians come. I've seen what happened in Bucha, for example, which basically channels like this just deny blankly, even though now there's even more new footage providing evidence of Russian soldiers killing civilians there. And basically it looks like something from the Second World War. It's absolutely horrific. Basically those kind of testimonies, if assuming they're real and it's not actually just staged, not going to be the most reliable. And actually the last point I should have mentioned is that you do have people who are there, and I've seen this with, not with any of these guys, but with some reporting from Patrick Lancaster. I did some videos on him up above in the card, down below in the description, where he interviewed a woman from Volnovakha, which is cities absolutely razed. You always have to remember, these cities are destroyed. Even the Russian side admits in Mariupol, 60% of buildings will have to be demolished. The Azovstal plant, it seems like they're going to demolish it at this point when I'm speaking. Like they've destroyed everything. So this old woman basically seemed to really want the Russian soldiers who would come in to fix her water for me. And she was basically repeating many of the Russian talking points that maybe she's just heard on the radio. She said, oh, the Ukrainians are blowing up those buildings. Can you fix my water, please? And I was like, well, I've already watched pro-Russian social media, and they actually have videos where they are kind of showing off that they're blowing up the buildings, unoccupied, the civilian buildings in that town. And then she's saying, no, it was definitely Ukrainians doing it when they're leaving. I was like, I'm not really convinced by that. And then she asked them to fix her water. So anyways, I find these testimonies very unreliable. And that's basically what they base on, in addition to statements from Russian officials, which is the invading army. So yeah, that's not normally in general the most reliable.
Alejandro Kirk is an amazing journalist. He's a journalist for Telesur TV, one of the few news organizations covering this story.
Again, Telesur, one of the few news organizations covering this story. Yes, because they're allowed be. He's allowed to be there all the time because he repeats their talking points. Of course, no one else is going to be allowed in. You can't just walk around in Mariupol with your camera unless you're going to do consistently pro-Russian propaganda. That's just the way it is. And like the Ukrainians are not going to let you walk around Kiev and do pro-Russian propaganda. Obviously, you're not going to be, because there's martial law in Ukraine, it's going to be the other way around. So this is just like ridiculous. So let's see, he then starts to exaggerate and embellish on what these journalists or useful idiots are saying.
He's seen a progression of the people in Mariupol and in other cities in eastern Ukraine. And he explains that the people there fear these Nazi spies, that if they speak on camera, they will be killed.
So there you go. People are scared of getting killed. But he says by Nazi spies, you mean the collaborators or traitors are scared because they're collaborating with Russian troops. I mean, that's what the claim is, right? I mean, of course, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. So maybe you see them as, if you're pro-Russian fascists, you're going to see them as honest civilians who are being liberated. And if you are not, and you're taking the Ukrainian position that they've been invaded illegally in an unjustified, unprovoked war, you're going to see them as, well, they're collaborators with the invaders. And in World War II, I just don't think people from the Allied side, so the Soviet side, or the, from 1941 to 1945, of course, 1939 to 1941, Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany, but, let's just skip past that part. I mean, that is pretty Nazi-like to be collaborating with them 100%, but we don't see the people who collaborated with, say, Nazi Germany, who helped them in any way, as being anything other than collaborators. And we don't in general have very much sympathy for them. But here, it's because of the Nazi spies. What is he talking about? Oh, you mean that you might be identifiable to the Ukrainian authorities as a collaborator? But again, you see, he's making this analogy connecting everything Ukrainian with being a Nazi, based on a tiny percent of the military being set up by some guys with neo-Nazi leanings. And by the way, in the last elections in 2019, far-right parties in Ukraine got 2% of the vote. So there you have. So basically here he's calling basically, in effect, it seems to me, all Ukrainians Nazis. And just think about that. Again, this is the kind of language to dehumanize people. And we've seen all the images of, there's probably tens of thousands of people dead in Ukraine. And a large part of it, it's a lot easier to kill someone if you think that they deserve it because they're a Nazi, or they're subhuman because they're a Nazi. So he's repeating this very, very hateful language because he's not saying, oh, this person here has made these Nazi statements like the original leaders, maybe the Azov Battalion. He's basically saying that all Ukrainians are Nazis by extension, or at least all the government is Nazis. But it's going to end up in the same thing by the end.
Well, we're learning more about the horrific occupation of this region by the Nazis and how they treated the ethnic Russians in this area over the past 8 years. Of course, we've been reporting on this show how a genocide has been unfolding for the last 8 years, ever since the Maidan coup.
All right, so there we got a lot to unpack in that statement. That's a pretty crazy statement. He said there's a horrific occupation by the Nazis. So he's basically again saying Ukrainians are Nazis. Like, it was part of Ukraine. It was controlled by Ukrainian forces. Now, the Azov Battalion was there, but then he says there's a genocide taking place. That's, again, a ridiculous talking point from the Russian government. So basically, to explain, in Donbass, in the war from 2014 until this new invasion on 24th of February 2022, about 14,000 people died in Donbass. That was a result of Russia's foreign policy and them invading Ukraine in 2014. First, they annexed Crimea, illegal under international law, and then they started the war in Donbass, and they backed these so-called separatists, but it basically has a lot of groups from Russia who are imperialistic, and the Russian government also sent troops there, as well as materiel. And of those 14,000 people who died, about 10,000 are combatants, so soldiers from both sides, and then about 3,000 to 4,000 are reported to be civilians. They were killed in either, they were killed either as collateral damage, or they were killed deliberately by both sides in the conflict. So you would need to have basically an international court go in and see exactly what has happened. I'm sure the Ukrainians committed some war crimes. I'm also sure that the Russian side in that committed some war crimes. The idea that there is a genocide, which is an extremely high bar to prove, is absolutely preposterous, right? That would be like you were trying to kill off all the population, or a large part of the population of the ethnic Russians, and obliterate them, basically annihilate them. That is clearly not supported by any evidence. And on top of that, think about cities like Mariupol, which are predominantly Russian-speaking. Again, he's conflating Russian-speaking with ethnic Russian, right? They are not the same thing. People who consider themselves Ukrainians very often speak Russian as their first language or at home. But, it's just like here I am in Ireland, and the vast majority of Ireland doesn't speak very good Irish. They speak English. Now, are they all ethnic English because they speak English? No one would claim that. That is ridiculous, right? But that's the same kind of analogy I can make in this case. Mariupol, a city of 450,000 people. How many dead Russian-speaking civilians are there as a result of Russia's invasion, right? So think they call the 3,000 to 4,000 civilians who died, presumably been killed by both sides, unfortunately, and definitely anyone who committed a war crime from either side in that war should face justice. They're conflating that with what they've done. They show off that 60% of the buildings will have to be demolished. There are tens of thousands of people who are probably dead as a result in this war who are civilians. Well, we're probably never going to know the true number, but it's going to be massive. Look at the level of destruction that has been caused. Is that not a genocide then of the Russian speakers by Russia, if that is the bar that they're going to use and the standard? Anyways, let's see what else this this guy misrepresents what's going on with.
And ever since the United States installed a puppet government in Ukraine.
Then he says the US installed a puppet government. So which government is that? Is that the government that was an interim government immediately after Viktor Yanukovych abdicated or fled or was overthrown in 2014 for a couple of months before they had new elections, in which time Petro Poroshenko was elected?
And most of the ethnic Russians in this region, by the way, speak Russian.
Again, conflating these two things together, speaking Russian with an ethnic Russian. And it's important to remember that the current president of Ukraine was elected in a democratic election with 73% of the vote. The far right got 2%, so the people you could really call Nazis in Ukraine got 2%. The Jewish Russian-speaking president of the country, right? So according to this, Clayton Morris, he's a Russian. He's an ethnic Russian, according to him. Zelensky does not consider himself an ethnic Russian, from what I can see. I mean, he's a president of Ukraine who had family who served in the Red Army, so fought against Nazi Germany, and part of his family also died in the Holocaust. So this is just like, ugh.
It was the Zelensky regime that, when the election was overturned in 2000, or the military coup happened in 2014, and the new government was installed, it actually was supposedly the democratic, upstanding regime that outlawed a language that was used in a major part of the country.
So then his wife chimes in, Natalia Morris, and this is just like so dumb what she says. She says the Zelensky regime, we don't usually in English use the word regime for a democratically elected government. I mean, I guess they're all regimes, right? Whether it's an autocracy, a dictatorship, or democracy, but it's just bizarre to say it. And I've seen this from other pro-Russian YouTubers. They say, the Zelensky regime. It's like, you mean the Ukrainian government that was democratically elected. And then she says that they were, I have to even go back. It's just so weird. She's talking about a military coup. The Ukrainian army in 2014, they did not overthrow Yanukovych. He was overthrown in part because of street protests that then, and the lack of support he had in the parliament, i.e. the guys who've been backing him from his party all voted against him, so then he left. But there was the army didn't come over and take over the parliament and the presidential palace and force him to flee. That wasn't a military coup. She's just like, I don't know, she's just living in a parallel universe here.
It was the Zelensky regime that, when the election was overturned in 2000, or the military coup happened in 2014, and the new government was installed.
So also, I had to watch it again because it's just like, there's almost nothing correct in her statement. You would think if you were listening to that, Zelensky took over in 2014. He was elected in 2019. There was an interim government for a couple of months, and then Petro Poroshenko won an election and he became the president until he was defeated in a democratic election, right, a free and fair one, by Zelensky, who was a newcomer. So the incumbent was beaten in a free and fair election. And she's just talking about the Zelensky regime. She's getting confused with all her talking points. Absolutely mind-blowingly idiotic.
Was supposedly the democratic, upstanding regime that outlawed a language that was used in a major part of the country.
So she says, it was outlawed in a major part of the country. You'd swear you can't utter a word of Russian in Ukraine listening to this BS, right? We used to have a joke amongst my friends in Ukraine that, here, the Russian speakers are oppressed, as we all speak in Russian, right, in Ukraine. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous what she's saying. You cannot equate introducing Ukrainian as a language of instruction with school with
there's a ban on Russian speaking in the country.
Like, what do you think happens? They walk around, there are these Nazis goose-stepping, Sieg Heiling with guns, and if they hear Russian, they start shooting people and torturing them on the street. It's absolutely preposterous if you've been to Ukraine. Yeah, you can speak Russian. You cannot, the only real difference is you can't speak Russian if you go, you can't do your communication with the government in Russian. You can basically only do Ukrainian at the moment, and the language instruction in schools is now Ukrainian. Does that sound like it's illegal to speak Russian in the country? It's too stupid to, let's go on.
Another fabricated story about the mass graves in Mariupol. The idea that Russians came in and killed thousands of civilians and then dumped them into a grave, right? We heard this story. Well, just like the other stories, this has been disproven by multiple journalists who visited the site of the so-called grave and found that it's actually a cemetery that's been there for years. There are a few hundred somewhat new graves in the cemetery, next to the cemetery, but all of them are marked with the names and the ages, and most of them are elderly. Now, we were told in the press, you heard these stories, right? There's 10,000 bodies.
So then they basically go on to reiterate Russia propaganda claims that basically there's no Russian war crimes, basically, is the bottom line. And they repeat that, and they claim that the media is lying about it, it's all fake. And their proof is to rely on useful idiot Russian state journalists when they are the side that has invaded and sacked Mariupol. Yeah, I thought, is it just a business to build up a big audience, make money through the advertising in YouTube, although now or build an audience off the platform and then monetize it that way. But then today I went and looked at their channel because they have been banned for 2 weeks, or suspended for 2 weeks. The videos were still there, but they couldn't do anything on YouTube, and then they came off that suspension. They obviously had this video was blocked for hate speech. Again, let me know down below in the comments whether you think it's hate speech or not hate speech, what they said in this video. But basically they explain themselves that they basically were suspended for 2 weeks because they had several videos at the same time that got them in trouble on their channel. And they came up with another video that kind of reveals a lot about them. So they went, in the meantime, it seems, to Serbia. And again, it has a very conspiratorial title. This is Serbia, the media won't show you. Oh, these titles I find so cheesy. And then they basically do a street interview with Serbs. They have one guy who kind of blames Putin, and then the rest of them all say Putin good, basically to summarize it, which is pretty common. I wouldn't say it's a majority opinion in Serbia. And that is shown on lots of videos on mainstream media when I go and look at it, so I'm not sure where this conspiracy is. Anyways, that's part of their spiel. But they say two things that are very, very I think enlightening about their perspective.
The memory is strong here of what happened in 1999. And imagine this city, this country being bombed by NATO forces. So when you ask them where do they feel, how do they feel about NATO, the memory is very strong. Imagine, they called it the 78 days of darkness, 78 days of bombing by NATO forces here, where people had to hide in their basements as NATO jets scrambled overhead and bombed targets all throughout the city.
So look at the kind of emotional way that he relates here. He makes Serbian civilians appear relatable to you and me when he's talking about the NATO bombing in 1999 of Serbia. Now, he leaves out the entire context of why that happened and who died in the bombing, and also in Serbia at the time, especially the Kosovar Albanians who were getting killed in grossly higher numbers than the Serbs were by the NATO bombing. But did you hear him talk about the Ukrainian civilians in those ways to make them relatable? No. For him, Ukrainian civilians, the same people hiding in basements, are Nazis, right? He dehumanizes one side in the conflict and then tries to humanize another side in the conflict. And that's extremely dangerous. It just shows, what can I say? The guy doesn't seem to perceive Ukrainian people as people. And I've been to Mariupol before the war, and he's describing the scene there in a park. What does he think Mariupol looked like before Russia, not Ukraine, Russia sacked the city? There were people out in parks exactly where he is in Belgrade, because I was in those parks only about 6 months ago. And they were walking, pushing prams, enjoying the nice weather there was that day. I mean, the Ukrainians have invested and tried to renovate a lot of the parts of the city to make it, they had an interest in that and saying, hey, it's still part of Ukraine, it's not under Russian occupation, like other parts of Donbass have been since 2014, kind of like West Berlin and East Berlin, right? Every side wants to give a good advertisement to be on their side. But, I sat there in this town, Mariupol, people were so friendly. And he seems to have had a similar experience in Belgrade, right? People were friendly to me, found it very interesting, talking to the local people. And they were out doing things that you and me also do in their town. I went down onto the port, people were laughing and smiling, I had great interactions, I had my camera with me. And it's all gone. All gone. And thousands and thousands of people are dead as a result. The city has been sacked like in medieval times. There's that infamous clip of the Chechen fighters in Mariupol when they'd taken, well, not all of the cities that turned out, but the city center, and there's a fire in the background, and they're celebrating destroying the city. That's Russia, right? And this guy cannot relate to those people. He calls those people who died, who are out, presumably the women and children, old people who are there pushing the prams, walking around enjoying a park just like he is in Belgrade. He calls those people Nazis, right? So remember, think about, is that hate speech or not hate speech? Well, you know how I feel about it, obviously, even though I'm not a big fan of YouTube and censorship. Let me just play one last clip from this when his wife Natalia chimes in again. Always golden when Natalia chimes in on something.
It's a humbling experience, if not very eye-opening, because in the West you can't even say Vladimir Putin, much less have him on a mug.
Is she serious? That's her big gripe, that you can't have Vladimir Putin? Does she want Adolf Hitler on mugs? It's also freedom of speech to have Adolf Hitler, maybe Stalin, maybe Mussolini, who else? Any big dictator, right? So she wants to have her mug with Putin and walk around with it proudly. Maybe she wants to buy a Putin t-shirt. It doesn't really bother me if she buys a Putin t-shirt, but you can see the mindset. This is who she wants to cheer for. She's upset because America doesn't support Putin, it seems, by allowing to have mugs and t-shirts and that you can sell them. Or I don't know, I presume actually in America you could buy a Putin t-shirt, but probably wouldn't be a big seller at the moment.
It's amazing to see the newspaper coverage here, the front pages of newspapers talking about Washington's aggression, Washington's New World Order.
And he rambles on about Washington's New World Order and NATO aggression. Russia invaded Ukraine, Clayton and Natalie Morris. NATO didn't invade Ukraine. Anyways, I don't want to have to watch these clowns again in our video, but I do it because it was a big request on the channel. As you can see, it is getting dark here on the west coast of Ireland. Actually, Serbia is a place that I've been to myself quite a bit. I had a great time there. And I've been to Novi Sad and I've been to Belgrade, the capital. So yeah, it was also something I consider now with the war going and filming in other parts of Europe. Anyways, let me know down below what you think of Redacted and them getting redacted by YouTube and their coverage, and of the whole kind of left-leaning, politically useful idiot, pro-Russia, which is definitely not a Marxist state. Putin is definitely not a Marxist, believe me. Maybe many things, Marxist is not one of them. Down below in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Slava Ukraini. I guess these guys are going to say I'm a Nazi now, right? Because I spoke Ukrainian. Do svidaniya, that's actually Russian. Just so they know, I can also speak Russian. Am I going to get arrested if I say it in Ukraine? I said that at the end of almost every video that I shot in Ukraine, and no one ever arrested me and I never got in trouble for it. So let's call BS on that. See you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.
SAR Experience.